Burnout is most likely to happen when someone is going through major life changes, and that's the one factor that gets ignored the most in the workplace. If you're a caregiver feeling like work suddenly got harder, or a leader wondering why the strongest people are starting to struggle, this may not be a performance issue at all. It may be that life has changed and your systems just haven't caught up. Hey y'all, I'm Courtney Cecil, and this conversation is specifically for the leaders and managers who are trying to support caregivers at work and feeling like something isn't quite working. Because right now, more caregivers are burning out and leaving the workforce. Not because they're opting out, but because the system isn't set to support them. So, in this episode, I'm going to break down what's actually driving that, what's at risk for your organization, and what you can do differently as a leader to retain and support your people more effectively. Now, let's start with getting the lay of the land. According to a study done by S&P Global and AARP, 60 to 70% of family caregivers work in some capacity. Meanwhile, the percentage of women leaving the workforce and caregivers experiencing burnout are increasing at alarming rates. Organizations are also under growth pressures they've never experienced before. This means that they need to be increasingly more strategic with the support they provide to caregivers to focus on what will actually move the needle and waste less calories on the resources that don't. In the next 30 minutes, I'll share some statistics that will make you think, understand what you're risking by losing caregivers, some root causes behind burnout, a paradigm shift that will challenge your learning and development approach, and the strategy you need to deploy to turn your management team into retention ninjas. This episode is unique in that I'll actually be sharing visuals to bring it to life. So the experience will be enriched on YouTube. If you're interested in pushing pause to review there instead, I've linked that in the show notes. Otherwise, let's tune in. So let's start with the lay of the land. Buckle up. You're about to drink some stats from a fire hose, but I think it's really important to set the stage on why this subject matters. In 2024, the Surgeon General released a report as a response to those post-pandemic trends and pressures. So his team studied the economics across the span of 37 years, from 1985 to 2022. And the punchline is essentially that we need to sound the alarm on the pressure that parents are under. Over this 37-year period, a mother's primary childcare time went up 40%, while a father's time more than doubled from 2.6 to 6.6 hours a week. So 154% increase. Then parallel to that, parents are also now working more paid hours than they were in 95. So from 1985 to 2022, mothers' paid work hours rose from 21 to nearly 27 hours a week. So essentially roughly 28% increase, while fathers' hours edged up 3.5% as well. So mind you, as I shared first, both are spending significantly more time on primary childcare, which further strains that system. But y'all, those are only national averages. So if you're looking at those hours per week and you're thinking, gosh, those numbers are really crazy low, you're probably right, because I'm assuming if you are in corporate America, you are spending far more time each day on childcare, and your work week likely far exceeds that of the national average. So then, according to a study done by Eagle Hill Consulting last year, 55% of US workers report experiencing burnout in 2025. 71% say burnout hurts their overall job performance, and 65% say burnout weakens their ability to serve customers. But here's where it turns into an operational problem. According to the same study, burned out employees are nearly 3 times more likely to say they plan to leave their employer in the coming year. And then that pattern continues. Much of the caregiving narrative focuses on children, but I essentially equate it to somewhat of the difference between parents with newborns and parents with elementary age kids or older. You just don't realize how much harder it gets until you go through it. And it's a very similar analogy to childcare and adult care, apparently. So, according to McKinsey, while globally, as opposed to all the other numbers being US focused, 22% of workers report high burnout symptoms compared to adult caregivers reporting a much higher rate at 37%. It is also worth drawing attention to the specific trends regarding women caregivers in the workplace. It's probably not going to surprise you to learn that research last year from Catalyst found that caregiving pressures are now the single most significant driver of women's workforce exits. So Catalyst also offered that this is not because women are opting out, but it's because women are being pushed out by systems that don't accommodate caregiving, the economic realities, and modern family life. According to Sparrow, Sparrow is a leave management platform, nearly half, 49% essentially, of US female employees say that caregiving responsibilities have led them to stymie or pull back on their career ambitions, compared to 32% of men. Then, according to Clio's Family Health Index, which was just released a couple weeks ago, if you are tuning into this, it was mid-March of 2026 that was released. According to that study by Clio's Family Health Index, midlife women caregivers are at especially high risk. 46% of women caregivers ages 40 to 55 are at high burnout risk, compared with 27% of women ages 25 to 40 and 32% of women 55 plus. This is thanks, of course, to the convergence of life responsibilities, work responsibilities, and hormone changes. So you probably get the picture on the data, but I still want to set the stage a little bit before I move on to the so what. So let's specifically talk about corporate America. The post-pandemic pressures came in really fast and really heavy. I'm sure you're probably feeling a lot of that, particularly the swell of doing more with less. So essentially, all the expectations from both customers and leaders that are putting pressure on us to feel like we need to do more and squeeze more out of the system. Then you couple that with the rise of AI. So all of that is pushing pressure and workload and change to happen at unsustainable levels. Then the pandemic also birthed this kind of always on culture where we feel like we always have to be plugged in. So let's just call a timeout and take a second and think about what life looked like before the pandemic. So first, we took conference calls, y'all, not video calls. So that meant you got to stretch, you got to snack, you got to carpool during meetings. And then furthermore, for many industries, we traveled a lot because we didn't have access to video cameras. So we needed a way to get more of that stronger facial recognition. But because we were traveling, it would take us materially longer to align schedules for meetings. Whereas now, people have the availability to easier align schedules, which means we are stacking meetings one on top of the other, and our calendars are already really crowded. There's also friction between how many of our more senior leaders learned and the working norms available for the younger generation to learn. So, as an example, prior to the pandemic and the normalization of hybrid work, many leaders had access to their teams without little planning. So, they'd essentially just walk out of their office and play a game of duck, duck, goose and pick whatever closest head there was to come in and problem solve with them. But now the speed of everything is moving so much faster. And it's often not synchronized, as in people's rhythms are often not moving in harmony with one another. And this is, of course, an overgeneralization, but there's also often some tension between the biases regarding how older generations prefer to approach development and the way the pace of change is forcing us to learn now. So nobody intends to be difficult with our point of view, of course, but it's human nature to think, you know what? I learned like this. That must be the best way to learn because I was successful. Ergo, this is what leads to success. But for most of us, that's also implying that the face time that you put in is directly correlated with your dedication to your career. And that's not actually true. So there's also this friction between the needs of management and the needs of entry level teammates. So, as an example, as I imagine you can relate, most of us have very full personal lives as we're also absorbing 5+ hours of daily childcare related responsibilities on top of work. So we're just not inclined to slow down and see who we're leaving behind, right? But here's the hitch in that. We were also afforded, as we were growing up in our career, the opportunity to learn the art of being a professional essentially by observation, which isn't available to the younger associates unless we intentionally teach them those very basic, like professionalism 101 type skills. Now, of course, they don't always see that as a hurdle or they don't care, but we know it's there for them. But y'all, guess what? Grooming the lower ranks is just one more responsibility on top of our already overextended calendars. So, in general, it's just harder now to be a working caregiver with this always on culture. Not to mention, if you're caring for an adult, you're likely doing so in a different geography from where you live. Or if you're raising kids, you very likely have no local family versus past generations where people live down the road from their families. Then there's the impact on today's working environment on women specifically. So, first, childcare rates are increasingly more unattainable. Statistically, according to Fortune, a household needs an income of $402,000 to meet the federal affordability benchmark of childcare not exceeding 7% of income levels. Yowzas. I know, right? Like, they're also likely only going to get worse with this deepening K-shaped economy, making it even harder for those already stretched thin. And I know that's technically not a women's problem, and I don't want it to be, but here's the truth. When childcare affordability becomes unattainable, women tend to be the ones that take the more flexible job to accommodate family needs. So, as an example, over half of mothers have reduced hours. And it's no surprise that according to NPR, 70% of parents say flexibility is their top job requirement, even outranking salary. Women also take on that more invisible load, both at work and at home. So much so that The Office made an absolute mockery of it. So remember the party planning committee? Or remember the episode where Pam was shaming other office workers for not keeping the microwave clean? Like, there's enough content within the office, let alone at large, to focus on the invisible labor, but it's there. And I feel a little bit like Captain Obvious addressing this as well. But I also have to acknowledge that women who give birth go through all of these other biological and mental changes that non-birthing parents don't. So think pregnancy and hormones and postpartum, alongside the disrupted sleep and emotional labor and dysregulation and distraction that comes later from perimenopause and menopause. So then what's at stake for organizations? First, you've got the loss of capital. The most obvious is that you're literally watching your institutional knowledge walk out the door, including the sunk costs you've invested in growing that person. But what about the less obvious, like the customer relationships that he or she has built? This is especially a risk for senior women who frequently are the relationship. Like, that's our superpower. Or the cost of onboarding someone new. For many strategic roles, you could have up to 12 to 24 months of lost productivity, in addition to having to pay anywhere between 50 to 200% more of the exiting talent's annual salary per employee by the time you account for recruiting, overhead, and inflated salary. That's a lot of money. That's real green bucks. Then there's the risk of specifically losing women. And in many industries, like the land of public accounting and law firms where I came from, about half of new hires are women, yet hardly more than a quarter make it into leadership ranks, according to a 2025 study by Rosenberg. It's just a cruel reality that the responsibilities in middle management peak at the same time women are experiencing this messy middle of life, often because the kids' lives just continue to get more demanding. And then that exposes firms to reputational risks, especially as many have visible leadership representation targets. And you know what? It's also no secret that the ones who do a good job at retaining diverse talent will have a distinct competitive advantage in continuing to attract that same diverse talent. Then this leads to the heart of what matters for every organization, and that's performance. It's been proven many times over that diverse leadership teams outperform those with homogenous makeups. And by the way, if you don't believe me, you got to read Malcolm Gladwell's Return of the Tipping Point. I just finished reading that this week, and it's almost exclusively about that topic. But it's more than just the quality of brainstorming and innovation that are at stake. for many risk-focused organizations, it's also a direct risk to their quality outcomes. So now let's pivot and talk about the cliff notes on what you can do about it as a people leader. The good news is there's a lot within your power to help your teams get ahead of burnout. And there's a lot beneath this, but here's some of the root causes that I believe are worth calling out and breezing through. So, burnout is likely to happen if someone is assigned to multiple projects, if overtime starts to become the norm, if there are many last minute pivots, think things like schedule changes and task changes, because all of those pivots cause a degree of rework. If there are bottlenecks frequently slowing someone down, if there's a high level of administrative burden, so someone isn't focused on their highest and best use as a professional, if there are frequent changes, or if they are going through major changes in life. So think things like promotions and new caregiving responsibilities and school changes and moves and family illness, and the list continues to go on and on. All of those are a recipe for burnout. But it's the last one on life changes that I'm most keen on, as it's the one that is both most disruptive and tends to get the most ignored in the work environment. I'm sure you've probably heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So essentially, if you're not familiar, Maslow's hierarchy of needs implies that in order for you to reach the peak potential as a human, you need to essentially have the base of your pyramid cared for. But here's the problem with traditional learning and where most organizations focus their energy. Most organizations focus at the top of the pyramid. So think about your continuous education journey and all the lessons that you've consumed. Just like school, they're probably quite academic and geared towards helping you be at your best as a technical practitioner. But home depletes our energy just as much as work. So think about it. In general, 50% of our waking hours are spent at work, which means the other 50% are spent at home. I know that sounds crazy because it's so easy for us to think that like work just consumes most of us. But really, for most people, it tends to be pretty 50-50. But then on top of that, if you're a caregiver yourself, 5 of those 8 hours at home are probably spent on other people, which leaves the remaining 3 hours to care for all of your needs. And I'm willing to bet that you spend much of that, like those remaining 3 hours, probably going back to work. So if you think about it, at work, we have infrastructure and processes that are in place to help us improve our effectiveness. But at home, we rarely have systems in place, and we definitely don't have interns. So this leaves such a gap in our teammates' abilities to feel like they're in control of their lives because life at home is often the thing that's keeping them underwater. So then what can you do about it? You can focus on what you can control. There's a lot that you can't control. So think things like the weather and traffic. But you know what you can control? You can control your response. So when you focus your energy on what you can control, things like grabbing an umbrella and leaving earlier, you waste a lot less energy and you get a lot better results. Then you just recognize the rest of it is what it is. Like it's just noise. So now let's think about this notion of the circles of control in response to what we're solving for here. So there's a lot that's out of your control, things that you're probably unlikely to be able to solve for, like our country support system. But the good news is you can decide how you respond to things inside your organization. So variables out of your control are things like what others' office policies are and how that puts further strain on your family based on your partner's availability. Public policies and infrastructure gaps, childcare availability and cost, and regulatory deadlines. But notice I didn't say client deadlines or team deadlines because people often interpret those requests that are coming from clients or coming from your bosses as black and white. But remember, they're humans too. Hence, that's probably something you can influence. So if you look at what you can influence in that middle circle, you can influence clients and team deadlines. You can focus and influence on change load. So there's less redirecting and the volume feels a little bit more manageable. And you can focus on building a culture that enables managers and promotes success stories. Then what's in your control? Well, first, know that flexibility, so think things like hybrid schedules and chrono working and well-being programs, like that sort of thing, those are becoming an expectation in modern day workforce, but they're not as much of a differentiator now, unfortunately. So while flexibility in itself is less likely to set you apart, you know what does? A really good manager. So let's talk about some of those specific actions that you can take if you manage people. So working left to right, the first pillar that you can focus on is structure. So you can design team schedules intentionally to provide balance. So think things like no meeting windows or rotating your teammates' travel. You can evangelize and normalize flexibility options, whether they be formal, think things like an FWA, or informal, things like chrono working or hybrid workplaces. You can capitalize on the benefits and policies that your company has in place, specifically in support of caregivers. So they're, of course, important for you to utilize, but also you should be proactively sharing those with your teammates who are going through those life transitions. And this is a little tongue-in-cheek, hint, hint, kind of wink, wink moment. I'm going to say it anyway. But you can also leverage a third party to assess norms, design strategies, and run coaching labs with new caregivers or managers or emerging executive talent to make sure they have the executive function skills that they need to manage their growing responsibilities. Then if we focus on the culture pillar, so I like to focus on a word called propinquity. Propinquity is one of my favorite words ever, and it essentially means the state of feeling close to someone. And guess what? It's created by intentionality, not proximity, like most people assume. As in, rigid in-office expectations are not needed if you're intentional about planning your weeks and the time you spend together, whether that time is remote or in person. And if you lead people, know that it's incumbent on you to be aware of the shadow you cast to others. So, as an example, if you are modeling that always on culture, that becomes the implied expectation. And I'm also a believer, by the way, in leaving loudly. So normalize that you're sharing that you're going to have lunch with your kid on a random Tuesday. So we are often keen to let people know that we're leaving because of a sick kid or because of a school play. But what about those little moments that make the days joyful? It's when you share those moments that you create the psychological safety for others to do the same. And I've already glossed over this, but be aware of any biases that you have that face-to-face time is synonymous with someone's commitment to success. It's not always true, not often true, actually. And then last, a career pillar. So first, reinforce non-linear career paths so talent is clear that it won't be perceived as lack of ambition or they won't be penalized for exercising flexibility and leave. Then provide real sponsorship. And I mean the kind where you're putting teammates in front of other senior leaders or marquee clients. There is nothing more powerful than feeling like someone in senior leadership is invested in your success. Then, most importantly, of everything on this page, don't wait for someone to be in crisis. So, get this, according to a 2025 survey by Eagle Hill Consulting, only 42% of burned out workers tell their manager that they're burned out. And among those who do, 42% say their manager never takes action. That's unexcusable, guys. Like that we got to do better, America. So the goal is to proactively surface those problems in your regular check-ins rather than waiting for someone to confess that they're struggling. And by the way, for perspective, according to a survey of US employees by that lead management platform Sparrow, 27% of women say they conceal caregiving responsibilities from leadership versus 10% of men, and 25% reported they hide it from HR compared to 15% of men. That tells you something about the psychological safety that people feel relative to this responsibility in corporate America. So start with those regular check-ins, asking questions like, so how is life outside work affecting you right now? Or what would help? And I'm sure you do this, but I want to say it anyway. Get curious about their constraints and aspirations before you propose solutions to them. Okay, friends, that's a wrap. I hope you heard one idea here that you can apply to your own career or in leading others. And if you're interested in getting support, engaging and retaining your talent from a former corporate executive, aka yours truly, you can contact me on my webpage at www.workingmomsmovement.com. I'll link that in the show notes, of course. Or maybe you're a regular listener who tunes in for the usual tips and tricks on how to manage it all. First, if that's you, thanks for indulging in this conversation. I think it's really important to engage directly with the managers and the people that can really make a difference. But also, if you realize that this is exactly what your P&L leader or HR representative needs to hear, I would be so grateful of you getting this episode in their hands. Okay, friends, that's a wrap. If this gave you a new lens on burnout and what your team might actually be navigating, the next episode you should watch is episode 67. That's where I break down how burnout quietly builds for high performers and what it's really telling you. And if you're a leader who's serious about retaining your talent, you can find more and how we can work together at workingmomsmovement.com. I'll see you in the next one.